Welcome. Welcome to Naples United Church of Christ Clergy Roundtable. This is the third session in our study of the book Love is the Way, Holding On to Hope in Troubling Times by Bishop Michael Curry. Being the third session, that means it's chapters 5 and 6, because we have 12 altogether in 6 weeks. And my name is Sharon Harris-Ewing. I'm the assistant minister here at Naples UCC, and I am pleased and happy to share this time with my colleagues and friends, the Reverend Dr. Dawson Taylor, who is our senior minister, and the Reverend Dr. Deb Kaiser-Cross, who is our minister for congregational care, for about one more month. And in that regard, I just have to say what a wonderful Sunday we had. Last Sunday, April 25th, of worship and congregational celebration when, for anyone who has not yet heard, we voted to call Reverend Angela Wells-Bean to be the new Minister for Congregational Care beginning in September. We are going to miss Deb terribly.
Thank you.
This is a time of transition. Besides that, do either of you have other announcements?
I have one. I'm very excited to be able to say that starting on Sunday, we're back to Canes for Communion on Sundays.
I know, which I was thinking about that earlier today, that while working on my sermon, that this will be the first time we've received communion together in person since March of 2020. So that's actually 15 months, right? Am I doing the math correctly?
14.
14 months. So, that's just kind of continues to boggle my mind about, we were challenged with how do we do communion apart, but I just think about how much joy there will be to celebrate it together. It'll be different, but, while we continue to kind of work through the social distancing and keeping everyone safe, but I think it'll be so much. I'm just looking forward to celebrating communion together. And if I could just say a word, I spoke to Angela briefly this morning. She and Andy and the kids made it home safely, or back to Massachusetts safely. I think we're going to go ahead and start calling Naples home for them. But, I was doing some other writing about this time in the congregation. Is we certainly celebrate Angela, her call. But, now we're in this critical time where we celebrate that, but we do the important work of saying goodbye to Deb and celebrating 35 plus years of faithful ministry.
40 years.
Is it really?
Well, yeah.
So I was doing the math.
Since ordination, like 38, but
right. Well, then,
I was
going to say you were serving
churches before that.
Exactly.
So, 40-some.
Yeah, and how fortunate we are that we got to be a part of that journey. And
I'm really grateful that this has been my last chapter of pastoral ministry, working with you two and this congregation.
And we will officially celebrate on Sunday, May 9th.
Exactly. But
Yep.
And that will be another grand time. And so that I don't forget, I also want to say thank you to our production team. Today, Brad and Alex are the people on I can't say on call. They're the ones working. And we appreciate what they do every time.
And Wendy, who actually, I heard her commenting to you, I think, Deb, before we came out here, that the flowers actually match the church's logo. Like only Wendy could think about that level of detail. So I was laughing in my office. As
Wendy gets us all set up and looking nice.
Yeah, I know exactly.
As best we can.
I know exactly, right. We can do. Yeah, with what she's working with, yeah.
All right, let's get to our conversation. Chapter 5 is called Love's Call and Love's Calling. And for each chapter, there is a parenthesis with a question. And I love this one. Won't loving everyone make me a doormat? So in the first part of the chapter, what I kind of call the introduction, he deals with this issue and asks the question, if I'm focused on the needs of others, which is what he says loving means, won't I lose myself? To which he says, no. The call of God is always a call to become the true you, not a doormat, the true you, not an imitation of someone else, the true you, someone made in the image of God, deserving of and receiving love. Sacrificial love isn't about ignoring or denying or destroying yourself. He says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is the biblical mandate. And he connects them to love your neighbor is to relate to them as also someone made in the image of God, and it is to relate to yourself as someone made in the image of God. So there's kind of these two themes, discovering your true self as someone made in the image of God, and then making that connection between loving your neighbor and loving yourself. What do you have to say about these ideas? Are they just sort of an obvious and a given, or were they meaningful as he wrote about them?
I would just jump in. I think I've said this before, but I think one of the fundamental, and he doesn't necessarily address this is just a thought that I have, but I think one of the fundamental challenges of this is that I think we live in a time and a place where people fundamentally struggle to love themselves. And so with the biblical mandate to love others as yourself, the only way that falls short or becomes problematic is if you're not loving yourself in whole, holy, and holistic ways. And so I think, and that's not a critique of Bishop Curry, but I think it's rather a statement on where we are right now as a society. And I think one of the challenges that we have as clergy and faith leaders is to continue to teach that kind of love that we're, again, not in a narcissistic way, obviously, but how do we love ourselves in a divine way, the way that that we believe God loves us? And, that's a fine line, but I think that's potentially a fundamental flaw. And I've run into a lot of people who I don't think know how to love themselves in healthy ways.
I don't have a lot to add to that, but I responded when you said, do you have any ideas on this, to the, if I'm focused on the needs of others, am I going to lose myself? And I was reading a study this week about the difference between happiness and joy. And happiness is based on what we receive. That we're happy when we receive what we want, but joy is always in giving. And I thought that was a really interesting take on the difference between them, because when I give of myself, I will be a more joyful person and living that purpose to which God has called us. So I just thought that was an interesting way to look at that.
Well, and picking up on both of those things, I think, Dawson, I agree with what you said, and that's precisely why I think he has to write a chapter like this.
Yeah.
And it's so confusing, because not only do we think, well, if I'm just loving other people, am I going to be a doormat and not take care of myself? But then we think, well, loving myself is selfish.
Right. So
I shouldn't do that. And I think I agree. We don't know how to do that and do it well. I think I also was connecting his discussion about true self to our last book, because we talked a lot about true self in Deep Rooted in Christ.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important idea. So I agree with all that.
I will say, though, that I think there's a generational difference in loving self.
Yeah.
And I think we have alluded to that I think many were taught who are of a certain age, and I was probably in that group, that focusing too much on myself was selfish. Yeah. But I also think that generationally,
I was going to say there's an extreme on the other end.
There's been kind of a shift sometimes, is that people are overly concerned with self.
I mean, I was going to say, I'm thinking about, I apologize, I interrupted, but.
No,
I'm just,
go ahead.
I'm laughing because there's also there's the extreme, and again, these are broad overstatements potentially, but there's the extreme of potentially this falls more in millennials, if we're going to, talking about generations, where, you got, it wasn't even the participation trophy. I mean, you got the big shiny trophy for just showing up.
Or just signing up.
Well, just sign. Yeah, exactly. Not even showing up, but signing up. Exactly. And and so I probably actually, now that I think about it, and now I reflect on it, is I'm Generation X, which falls in the middle there. And so again, speaking abroad, overtones. But we aren't the generation that got the trophy for signing up or
Right.
even showing up, but we got less of the message about, taking care of ourselves is a bad thing, but we weren't coddled to the degree. We were coddled, but not to the degree.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
definitely the two.
Yeah, so we're kind of pulled in
Yeah.
the middle, and that's probably, so I probably speak to that tension, if you will, in some interesting ways. So I think that's really interesting. But as soon as you were grinning, I thought to myself, oh, I bet I know where she's going with this. Because you're exactly right. There is this, I think it is where that can really get pulled, because there are those who think if I do anything to take care of myself, it's really selfish. And then there are those who think if it's not about me, then why are we here?
That's exactly it. That's exactly that tension.
Yeah.
All right, that's just a little bit of the beginning. So I'm going to move us along. In the next section, Curry shares some of his personal experiences related to his faith and eventual call to ordained ministry. His father was an Episcopal priest, and his grandfather, a Baptist minister. Good combination.
I know.
But when he went to college, he thought he might go into law or public administration. What he found out was that he was most interested in religious studies, especially reading works of great leaders whose spirituality and insight contributed to work that brought positive social change. And I think that you see that lived out in his life later. And he says this was the early 1970s. He talked about the music of the times and the ubiquitous presence of marijuana in the dorms. And then he describes an experience that brought, as he says, God from the background of his life to the front of his consciousness. A friend in his presence nearly died from a drug overdose. In his words, a night that began with me dancing on my feet at a party ended with me on my knees talking to God. And then he goes on and he talks about the story of John Coltrane, his music, his addiction, his cold turkey withdrawal, and then his composition of a musical piece about his struggle to overcome his addiction, the piece called A Love Supreme. And on the album cover, Coltrane wrote, "In the year of 1957, I experienced, by the grace of God, a spiritual awakening, which was to lead me to a richer, fuller, more productive life." Now, Curry acknowledges that his own experience was nothing compared to Coltrane's, but what it was, nevertheless, it was an experience of that same love, the loving and utter reality of the living God. The college chaplain became a mentor to him and helped him find his way to seminary and ordination. I just found there was a lot of power in this story. For anybody who's not reading, you should. A wonderful storyteller. It's almost a memoir, but he tells such powerful stories, and this is one of them. So I have two questions, and you can answer one or both. I'm not going to say neither. So have you had what he called dark journey of the night experiences like Curry's that were transformative? And if so, what are you willing to share? But then on a less intense note, can you tell us about your journey to seminary and ordination and mentors and experiences that got you there? Your pick.
I'm going to pick number one because, frankly, number two, you're going to hear that story in my sermon on my Celebration Retirement Sunday. So we're going to let that be. So the first one.
So stay tuned.
Stay tuned, because I just wrote it today. So for me, I've had a lot of dark night experiences, but I've also had some really joyful ones where I felt God's presence. So I would say, without going into all the details of it because it's kind of personal, my dark nights have always been at either decision points or at times of grief and loss. So decision points, when I made a decision to work as a volunteer in an organization in a prison instead of going to grad school. That was just it was a dark night wrestling.
Yeah.
The same when I felt a calling to ministry. Another time when my cousin died in a plane crash and I was caught with what's the meaning of life. And my sister lost 2 children. And so all of those pieces were times that brought me to my knees and helped me grow into a different kind of faith and trust in God, not expecting all the good things of life, but just knowing God was with me through those dark nights.
Yeah, first of all, I just had to share that I learned over the weekend, as Bishop Curry talks about his undergraduate experience, that we have church members who have a grandchild graduating from the same college next month. And I just thought it was really cool that I had never had a tie to the college. I'm drawing a blank on the name. I meant to write it down, but I was
It's 2
talking to these-
words. I remember that. It's 2 words.
Yeah, it's super.
Was it
It's
Hobart
Hobart.
and William Smith?
Yeah, and
If you live in Western New York, you've heard of it.
yes, and I was talking to these church members over the weekend, and was asking when they're going north, and they said, well, actually, we're going earlier than usual because we have a grandchild graduating college. I said, oh, great, where are they graduating from? And they said, well, actually, from the same college that Bishop Curry went to. And I said, well, that's rather astute of you. And they said, no, we're reading the book for the Clergy Team. I said, oh, great. So I just thought that was a neat connection. So I think for me, certainly dark nights that I could point to, unfortunately for the human experience, no shortage of those. But I would say I'm going to actually go with number 2 since Deb went with number 1, that the call to ministry experience was interesting because it was not where I was going. I majored in political science as an undergrad, did a congressional internship in Washington, and really saw myself headed there, and just had a wonderful mentor who actually I spoke to this week, and who I kept saying, I think I want to go into politics, but I just see things that I don't want to be about. But I've only seen ministry through the eyes of my family, and he said, come work with me for a year. I can offer that. And so that's the reason that I worked at a church for 3 years, because he offered a year, I stayed for 3, as we joke. And so that's the period of time that before I went to seminary, between undergrad and seminary, was because he gave me this great gift where I could be me without my family, although my grandmother had attended that church. So there were people who knew me and knew my family, but it was a large church, and I could just explore ministry before investing the time and the money in graduate education. And that's really where I fell in love with ministry, because I really did work 6 days a week because of kind of the way the schedule was. And there wasn't ever a day that I didn't wake up and want to go to work. And I knew that was just a very tangible sign of how much I love ministry. And so he helped give me that gift in a real tangible way. And I will be forever indebted to him in lots of ways.
That, yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'll sort of give a short answer to both. But when I was thinking about it, I reacted to the dark journey of the night, because when I've thought about the dark times, they don't last just a night.
Yeah.
It's not that one moment, but again, it is a transition times and trying to figure out where God is calling next, and people along the way who help me to feel like God is speaking and leading me. And I certainly had mentors and people who were very inspirational as models, as well as mentors. It's an interesting sort of historical thing for me to remember that I first said to anybody out loud, maybe I'll be a minister, when I was in junior high school.
Wow.
And I said it to our associate youth minister, who was a student at Wesley Seminary.
Okay.
Great person, and I cared for him deeply. What's interesting to me is it was like no reaction. Like, it wasn't, that's a wonderful idea. But neither was it, no, women can't do that, or girls can't do that, or whatever. It was just kind of a non-reaction, so it just kind of lay there for a long time, and it was I think of myself as part of speaking of generations, the generation that went to college. All I knew is I want to work with people. And it was over time that working with people was in the context of the church. Partly because what I realized, I studied human development, a specific choice because I thought psychology was about rats, and I didn't want to study rats. I wanted to study people. But but then what happened was I felt like my understanding of people, my psychology, if you will, and my theology were so intertwined that I couldn't separate them, and I wanted to be in a place where I didn't have to separate them, and where I could join what I believed about people from a psychological perspective with a theological. So,
May I ask a quick question? I'm just curious because I think I hear a thread, and I'm curious to test my theory. Would you all describe your call to ministry as you worked that out as a dark night? In the sense of trying to discern that call and grappling with where God was calling you.
Oh, yeah. For me, yeah. I would say it, without going into all the details of it, it meant leaving a relationship because the person I was with at the time did not at all understand ministry.
Yeah. Well, and we see who you ended up with. So, no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Which opened the door to the person I married.
But
it was
I mean, I make
that.
light only because But that's a serious thing.
It was
yeah.
a decision.
Yeah.
I knew that
Yeah.
I could not both be with that person
Right.
and
make that decision
be a
and
pastor.
follow that. Yeah.
It would not. Our paths were just so
Right.
diverging. So yeah, there were dark nights in there. There was a lot of wrestling with God
Yeah.
in the process of it. I mean, there was joy.
Sure.
But
and I would say not particularly.
Okay.
And it's interesting, how God works, but I was literally my program was called Human Development and Family Studies. And there was a woman who was probably 2 or 3 years ahead of me, who had graduated from that program, who was at the seminary I went to. And when I went to visit the seminary, I stayed with her, and there were just, it was Colgate Rochester Divinity School, but it was also Crozier Theological Seminary. Crozier was where my pastor had gone.
That's right, yeah.
Where my uncle had gone. My uncle had been a pastor in the Rochester area. So sort of knowing what I was going to do with it necessarily wasn't clear, but making the choice to go from college to seminary.
Because you went directly.
I went directly.
Yeah.
In fact, I double dipped and overlapped.
Right. Yeah.
So
wow. I took about 1.5 years off and then went to seminary.
The reason I was asking is, having, like you all, having so many friends and colleagues that are clergy, a lot of the call stories are these grappling with God, and grappling with the call. And so there is some dark night of the soul. Again, like you said, Deb, a lot of joy, but, there's that wrestle. And I think people who are not clergy don't always understand that. And it's not an exclusivity thing. It's just I think people often think of ministry as like the blinding light, and it's just all this great joy. But I mean, I know a lot of people, myself included, who really, it was a multi-year grappling, and there were some really intense, almost at some points, like deal making with God. Okay, God, I'll consider this, but and.
But on the other hand, there was such a deep joy and sense of rightness to it that I was willing to go through that.
Sure. Right. No, I don't regret it at all. And I will say that so many colleagues and friends, certainly there are dark nights in ministry, and I think we've been through one where we've talked about this, where clergy burnout is exceedingly high right now after COVID, and we're seeing that. We were talking about it recently at one of our team meetings, but I just think most clergy do experience that deep joy and that the joy of following where they believe God is calling them. But it's just interesting to me, and I think it's something we don't really talk a lot about, is like there is that wrestling that we often go through, that some of us go through for years. I mean, and certainly second career colleagues will talk about,
That,
like,
yeah.
I had an entire career before I said yes, kind of thing. So I apologize. I didn't mean to.
Well, and two things that I think about. One is, having said that, I feel like it was a relatively smooth path. Seminary was hard.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Because it was, and intentionally so, because they want you
So
to
they
wrestle,
kind of break down the.
wrestle with what you really believe. And, you grew up in a church, you think you know, so let's talk about this. So that I experienced.
Yeah, I remember watching people cry
Oh,
in
yeah.
like introduction to Old Testament and things like that. I mean, because like it's not Sunday school. I mean, the idea is that if you're going to deal with people who have questions of faith, that you better have worked through it.
Right, and that the Bible is more than just things to memorize and all that kind of thing. But the other thing is that, and you both know enough about my history, and I'm not going to go into it all, but I feel like my journey in ministry has had a lot of twists and turns that I never saw ahead.
Yeah.
And so some of those decision points were some of the,
Yeah.
not nights, but long
Yeah.
time
So I
journeys.
apologize.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to
that's
take
all
us.
right.
I just was
All right.
curious as I listened to us reflect.
So this is an interesting thing, and it kind of relates to that, especially in terms of potentially women. Curry begins the next section by saying that his father didn't necessarily encourage him to become a clergy person, but he did want him to be proud of who he was. And I think this is so interesting. In 5th grade, he took a book out of the library, Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. And I can just so visualize this because I did this so many times. He put a paper bag cover on it. I mean, I could probably still do it if I needed to.
Yeah.
And his father pointed out that he didn't put covers on his other books, so that there was something he didn't want his peers to see that he was reading this book. And Curry talks about the temptation to self-hatred, not only for Black Americans, but for anyone society doesn't roll out the red carpet for, and about his learning from others how to find his voice as a Black Episcopal priest. So what aspects of that story do you relate to? Who taught you to be proud of who you are, and what things did you feel like you had to hide because of your peers?
Okay, well, that's a lot of questions.
I know I do that. It's not my best feature.
I will say, my mother tells a story. It may or might not have been true at all, but she told me that when I was in kindergarten, my kindergarten teacher said that Debbie could do anything she wants to do with her life. And my mother said that to me hundreds of times. Whether or not that it was ever true, I knew that I would be encouraged I could do anything, or at least I felt that, and I will be always grateful to my mother for that. But the part of the story that really resonated with me is that I was a book lover too, and I remember I was a pretty shy elementary age kid. I was much more of a bookworm, and I kind of had just a couple of friends, and I was embarrassed to be that bookworm often. And so embarrassed and proud of it at the same time. So books were a huge part of me figuring out who I was and what I wanted to do with my life. And I mean, countless books. Madeline Langle's books that had the spiritual undertones. I remember reading Catherine Marshall, trying to figure out faith stuff. So the library was a lovely place for me to discover who I was.
I just think about, when you were talking about that story that you were saying, I think about the Native American tradition that sometimes when telling a story, they'll say, I do not know if this happened, but I know it to be true. And I often apply that to biblical teaching as well, but how that shaped your life.
It shaped my life. I mean, and she has said, even till the day she died, she would tell that story to other people about me. She didn't have a story for each of the kids, but that was my story. And and every one of us felt like we had something to give because of whatever story she chose for each one.
Yeah.
So,
I'm really fortunate that I chair the GLSEN board of Collier County, which formerly was an acronym that stood for Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And I'm struck by, when I was listening to this chapter, that I think it was at last month's board meeting, we were talking about how to make material accessible to LGBTQ plus and questioning young people in our county who might be embarrassed to read material that is informational and educational and obviously age appropriate, and how to make it accessible to them in the schools where they, if they're embarrassed or might not, it might not be safe for them to take home, how they can get that material, because, computers in public schools, and I believe that this is appropriate, are locked down in a way that they probably can't search material like that. And obviously, if they're not safe at home, they can't use a home computer to search material. And so they do turn to books and things that we can help provide. And so we actually have a grant from a foundation in Southwest Florida to provide books from actually elementary school on. But how do we do it in a way where they have access to it? And so I was thinking about that when he was talking about this, how, we all have, I think, things that about ourselves that we want to know more about, but perhaps we're afraid to either ask or we're intimidated or don't feel safe to ask. And I certainly, that's part of my passion around my work in GLSEN, is that I don't know that I would have had the courage as a young person to read books like that, but to know that they were available, I think would have made a huge difference in my life. And so I think that being raised in a pretty healthy family system, has made such a tremendous difference in my life. And I yearn for that for young people, especially, girls who can be taught that they can do anything, and LGBTQ youth who can be taught that they can be themselves. And I just think about right now, transgender young people who are just really under legal attack throughout our country. Yes. And it just really grieves me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I keep looking at the time and thinking, I have to move along. We have 2 chapters, and I've not finished one. But I have to go to this next story because this is another really powerful image for me. Curry talks about in 2016, a year after he was elected the presiding bishop, the Union of Black Episcopalians, I didn't know that existed, but there are a lot of groups out there I didn't know exist, so held a gathering in Christ Church Cathedral in New Orleans. And the Bishop of Louisiana decided to have Curry participate in what was a liturgical tradition of seating of the bishop in the bishop's cathedra, the chair. And the chair in this cathedral in New Orleans was carved and assembled by slaves and was originally the chair of a bishop who was a secessionist who joined the Confederate Army. And so there was some discussion about, do you use it, do you not use it? And the Bishop of Louisiana said, this is really important. And Curry said, to seat me, the descendant of slaves, in that chair seemed to him to say something that words alone never could. It was an opportunity to reclaim it, to redeem the past, and point toward a reconciling future. It was a moment of recommitment to the hard work of redemption and reconciliation, which starts with honesty about ourselves and our complicity with the past. I just think that was such a powerful image, and I'm just wondering, are there other examples that come to your mind when something happened that the image or the event said more than you could ever say in words about redemption and reconciliation?
Well, he alludes to it, but I just couldn't help but not think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Of course, I'm such a Desmond Tutu disciple, but that was painful work. And South Africa, I don't think, has still recovered from, obviously, the economic and social change that they've been through in the last 25 years. but I am convinced that they will be a better nation and a better people. And I wonder how the United States would be different if we did that kind of work after what we've been through since George Floyd's death. I mean, there's lots of other things, but I just think that's a watershed moment, the civil rights era, the gay rights era, the women's rights era. I mean, I just think about if we did more accountability and reconciliation work, what that might look like for us.
I don't have anything to add to that because that's what I was going to talk about is truth reconciliation. But on a personal level, something did come to my mind. My father could never understand me being called to ministry. Wow. He was Catholic. He didn't really get it. He didn't understand why I didn't feel at home there. And yet he worked really hard. I mean, we had some distance for a while. And I've shared this story, but for a long time, it was just tense. I invited him to my ordination. My parents came. And my father handed me a box that had pearls in it. And in my family, to give someone pearls means it's a sign of just unconditional love. And so that was his own way of reconciling me to himself. And he never really probably got it, but he was nothing but supportive, for all the years that he was alive. So on a personal level, that was my metaphor.
Oh, that's beautiful. And I thought of several different things, public things, but I thought of what it meant for me and certainly for Black Americans when Obama was inaugurated. I thought about when South Carolina decided to take the Confederate flag down from the Capitol after it was less than a month after the shooting of the 9 African Americans. And the other thing that came to my mind, and I don't care where you stand politically, Biden's acceptance speech, when his family and Kamala Harris's family were on that stage together, it was this beautiful, all colors and religions, and it was just a beautiful image of the human family that just moved me greatly, and would that we could all stand together with so much affection.
Well, and Mississippi has a new state flag.
Yep.
That's huge.
It really is.
That's very significant.
Yeah. All right. The last section of chapter 5 says everybody's got a way to give, and he tells about how ordinary people served others in extraordinary ways, but I really do want to give us some time on chapter 6. So I'm going to skip to chapter 6. It's not easy. I'm just a regular person. Can my love have an impact? The introduction to the chapter emphasizes what I believe is an incredibly important but difficult message to live out. We can't do it all. My job is to do my job. Yours is to do yours. God is God. We are human. And these are Curry's words. Our task is to do our task, not to do every task needed for progress to happen. When we accept that, we free ourselves to do what we can with the time and resources we have. Have you learned this lesson? And what difference does it make in your life and ministry?
The older I get, the more comfortable I am with that. I'm quite content to know that I am just called to do my part and I'm not called to do everything. Was that true earlier in my life? Absolutely not. And now I really do. I've learned probably from doing as many funeral services as I do, as I always ask the question, what is this person's legacy to you? And it's really interesting to hear. It's the small things that are the legacy. It may be some big things, but for most people, it's the small things added up that have made a life of significance. And so I can be okay with that. I really can. Small things.
So at age 42, I cling to words like that. But I'm actually in this interesting time, I believe, in my life and in my professional ministry where I'm slowly shifting to that. It's a realization, a maturity, a self-awareness. I've been in this role, in the senior role, for about 5.5 years. I've been in ministry 15 plus years, where I'm increasingly comfortable with going home at night knowing the to-do list will be there tomorrow, and it will be there in 10 years, and it will be there when I retire, and that I'm called to be faithful, not always productive. And that's, and it's, in some days, months, years, I'm better at that than others, if I'm really honest. And how I know I'm maturing is that I know that I'm aware of that more days than not. But like anyone, be it a corporate CEO or anyone else, I think can get caught up in the trap of productivity and accomplishments, or all those things. And but I think pastoral ministry is an interesting place where you're responsible for. I was actually speaking about this earlier today with a colleague. You're responsible for the community. And, so that's where something like COVID is so interesting. You're responsible for everyone, not just those who speak loudest. And that can be a really interesting, but it's a sacred gift. And so, yeah, I'm so fortunate to have really wonderful people around me, and I have really wise mentors. And so I listen to them. But like I said, some days are better than others with that.
And I would say yes and no, because I always say both and. But
Yeah.
in my head, I get it, and it keeps me sane, or somewhat sane. In my heart, not always, because sometimes I just feel overwhelmed by the pain of the world and the things that need to be done. And the other piece of it for me, and I'll use as an example the Justice Committee, because I work with the Justice Committee, is even knowing, well, I only have to do my job, or that committee only has to do its job. There's so much to be done. How do I know what is my job and where to put my priorities? And that's a combination of listening to God and also figuring out where the greatest need is, and there's so many pieces of it. But there's a related question and issue that Curry goes on and talks about, and that is that even when we're just doing our job faithfully, we don't always get to see the results. And he says, as one person, it's easy to feel as if my task is so small, it doesn't matter if I do it or not. It's especially hard when, as is usually the case, I am not going to see the results myself. Curry is very clear on both points. Faith is taking your best step and leaving the rest to God. We may never see the end results, but that's the difference between the master builder and the worker. Accepting that change doesn't necessarily conform to any human timeline or plan is the first step. The second step is to stop worrying about it and get moving. So, how do you feel about planting seeds and not seeing the fruit?
I have long lived under the quote, plant a tree under whose shade you shall never dwell. I'm okay with that. I really am. I'm much more convinced that I just need to show up, be present to people, give my best, and God will take care of the rest of it. I mean, I am very content with that now. Was I always? Absolutely not. And maybe it's getting to that retirement stage where I just have to trust that I've been able to make a difference, and we all have made a difference. We we'll never know, and that's okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think about a colleague that I worked with in Dallas. We used to talk about how we found joy in mowing grass because you could
Oh, yeah.
see
Yeah.
the immediate result of it. And it's really true, like, because in ministry, that is so often, like, you plant the seeds or you hope for the best, or you start a ministry and you think, at some point I'm going to be called away from this, especially growing up Methodist. You really knew you were going to be called away from it. And so you just hoped that, that you built a strong enough foundation or that God was a part of it and things like that. And so I've been really fortunate that I can look back on things that I've started or that I've been a part of that are growing or still a part of the churches that I've served. But that was the immediate joy, was you could mow grass and see the immediate result, but you knew it was growing and it would need to be mowed, especially in Texas the next week. But there was immediate gratification, instant gratification in that. And
Yeah.
so there was something about that. I mean, I think it's one of the things I enjoy about working in my yard is I can see progress. I mean,
Right.
And the beauty for me of getting older is still having some connections with people whose lives
Yeah.
I had contact with, and to see what's happened in their lives. So there's something to be said for that because you can see some of it.
And I hope that you, especially as you're approaching retirement the next month, that you will also be able to use or give yourself permission to use words like impact. Because,
Yeah, I-
I think especially knowing your time at Jupiter and then obviously your time here, but I can only imagine the countless people whose lives you've impacted that I know you still have contact with.
And I just trust that, even if I can't see it.
True, right.
Our
And so
lives
rarely do.
matter. And it's not just me, it's not
Right.
just you. Every single life matters if, in fact, we are saying, God, use me to make a difference somewhere,
Right.
even if it's small.
Yep. I think that's true. And I have to say, one of the things that I thought about in this is how incredible and such a model it is for somebody like Curry to talk about this, because I just think about the unbearably long struggle for racial equality and real freedom. And I understand the impatience that people have been planting seeds for centuries, and we're still waiting for the tree to give shade. But he is such a person of hope.
He is.
That knowing it all, he can still say that and still be a person who's planting seeds all the time. And he talks about in this chapter and the idea that we can make a difference. He talks about the community of Lincoln Heights, Ohio, where he went in 1982. And he talks a lot about sort of the sad history of this was the first all-black self-governing township north of the Mason-Dixon line. But then progress took a step forward and a step back, and the white communities nearby grabbed a bunch of the land so that things kind of fell apart. But being, as I just said, the relentlessly hopeful person that Curry seems to be, he goes on to say, hope comes from surprising places. And almost since the founding of Lincoln Heights, the kids there were able to attend one of the very best schools in the country because of two Episcopal nuns who created the town's first parish and school. And he talks about the church and the school and there being points of light and hope in a community. And then he talks about serving there and the 70s and into the 80s, still really struggling, and his first experience really of community organizing.
Yeah.
And that kicked off my first real experience of being part of the leadership team seeking to organize a community. As the African saying goes, move fast alone, go far together. Without going through all the details about what they did, they created a network of daycare, but they made a huge difference in that community. So I'm curious just again about your experiences of times when communities have come together effectively to do things together, to go far instead of fast.
Yeah, like one of the best models I've ever seen, and I think it would be really workable in this, excuse me, in this area, is a model called Interfaith Hospitality Network, and it's where churches house those who are homeless and open up their facilities, and the communities move each week, and they provide, the host churches provide meals, and there's lots of guidelines and things in place to protect both the families and the churches. But I mean, I've just seen churches come alive, and my mom particularly has been very involved in that. But I've seen it in different communities, and it's just a really amazing model. It's interfaith, ecumenical, it's all those things, but it's tangible, and that's what I love about it. Is, I don't know if, I think you and I've talked about that, but I can't remember if I have or not.
There's another term for it
Okay.
in the east coast of Florida.
Okay.
I can't remember what it is, but it's the same model.
Yeah.
The very first job I had was with a community organizing. It was called Fresno Metropolitan Ministry, and I went from college and I worked on one of their projects. They did community organizing in terms of housing and health and food insecurity, and I got to work in the jail with first-time offenders in an alternative sentencing project. And all the churches in that community came together, especially the Mennonite and Brethren and the congregational churches came together to do something in that community. And it was my first look at it, and they did amazing work, run by UCC ministers.
Yeah.
So.
It's interesting, the interfaith that comes up. One of the things I thought about is when I first moved to Buffalo in 1983, there was the Council of Churches, as there was in many places, Protestant churches. And many years later, 2009, I think, that had evolved and become not just Catholic and Protestant, but Muslim and Sikh and Baha'i, and it is now the network of religious communities. And they do advocacy, but they also do programs. Yeah. We all get email newsletters from different churches, and from one church that I get in where I lived in Buffalo, tomorrow they're doing the Walk of Abraham with Muslims and Christians together, walking actually from the Presbyterian Church to the Islamic Center, and then they will break the fast together under a tent so they can be outside. But that is, that's one of my passions is bringing people of different faiths together. Moving us along, I hate to do that, but talking about the long haul, about not seeing fruit, I think Curry has just some wonderful quotes. Progress does happen, but not always when we want it to or in the way we think it will. But this much I know, if I let God be God and I do my job in God's economy, that's enough. As St. Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. And so at the end of the chapter, he goes back to the questions from the very beginning of the chapter. What's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. What's the second best time? Right now. So he says it's impossible to know in the moment how a small act of goodness will reverberate throughout time. Since we can't start, we can all plant seeds. Since we can't start 20 years ago, the best time to start is today. So what are the seeds that need to be planted right now?
I will answer the other questions you asked
Okay,
instead
go for
of
it.
that one.
I was trying not to ask so many questions.
That's such a massive question.
Again, she's getting so bold as she gets
I'm like,
closer.
hey, I don't like that question. I'm doing the other one.
I'll do what she'll just answer whatever she wants.
But I think what I took from that is, what would if a congregation member said, what do I need to do? Mm-hmm. I would probably say, pay attention to what your gifts are, what you're passionate about, and what your life struggles have been, because in one of those, you will likely find a way to serve. And, or in all three. I just know so many people who are gifted in certain areas, and that's what they go for. I mean, you are very, very involved in advocacy things, in public education. You have gifts and passions there. That's where you're headed. Yet I also know people who are in recovery, and they use their struggles and to make a difference. So it's gifts, passions, and struggles. Pay attention, because I think you can do great work in there.
What is it that that quote that Bono used many years ago at the prayer breakfast? It's that to find where you want.
Oh, that's Buechner.
Yeah,
Frederick
he
Buechner.
used it. Yeah, but it
it's,
was Bono has brought it to.
Let's see, our vocation is where, where our passions
meets the world's
world's hunger.
hunger. Yeah, yeah.
Where
yeah.
our deep passions meet the world's hunger.
Yeah, yeah. Again,
And that's your sermon too, right?
And yeah, that's kind of my sermon.
So we're not going to talk about it now.
Okay.
That's my.
But
that's
again, yeah, I know
yeah.
it's Buechner, but you know, Bono kind of brought it to the forefront.
Well, it's
and,
a- it's
and
a
it's really kind of
powerful
funny.
line.
I've seen a few internet searches where Bono's credited. I'm like, no.
No, that was
yeah.
Buechner in Theology of
Yeah,
ABCs.
I was going to say, go to sleep.
Right.
So, you know, what seeds need to be planted? You know, I meant to message you today and say, so with that question, do you mean the church, the world, our personal lives? You know?
Yes.
Yeah, and I figured
Yeah,
that
it
would be
was-
your answer, so I thought, I'm not even going to bother. So, like, I think we're coming into a time where I think for all of those, my answer is we need the seed of patience. Because I just think, like, everywhere I turn, I just feel like I'm met with this impatience. Because, and rightfully so, like that's not a critical statement. It's because, I mean, my gosh, it's been a year of hell. Like, I mean, let's just name it. But I think we're all so eager to get life where we want it that it's like we want what we want now, and that's at every level. It's at the church. It's in our society. It's, you know, I want to go to a live concert. I want to travel. I mean, and I've been fortunate. Have done a little bit of that and get to do a little more, but it's not like it has been. We want life as we want it, as it was in February of 2020, before, or even January of 2020, before we really knew what the coronavirus was about. And I think we collectively understand that, but we're not there yet. And we seem to want to take pot shots at anyone who wants to tell us differently. Yeah. And so I just wish, as a society, as a church, as family units, as individuals, we would just take a collective deep breath and just plant that seed of patience.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how this is always the case, but we come at it in a slightly different question, because part of what, for me, if I were to have to name one thing, it would be related to building human relationships, because I am so, I just feel like the polarization and the division and the inability to see the other as somebody who's also made in the image of God, that so many other things rest on that if we could plant that seed of every human being is made in the image of God, and we need to figure out how to get along and walk this road together. There's lots to be done. This is a wonderful book, and I have been reading, I'm almost done, so I know there's lots more good stuff ahead, but I would like to end this evening. These two chapters I think of kind of like bookends or two sides, the affirming love's call and love's calling, that what God is calling us to do is to live the way of love. And then the other side, acknowledging that that's not easy, but that God has given gifts to each one of us, and that we can make a difference, especially when we work together. And back in chapter 5, he included a passage that I would like to end with. It's from the poem On the Pulse of the Morning by the late Maya Angelou. And it just, it's a word of hope, and I like to end on a word of hope. So say the Asian, the Hispanic, the Jew, the African, the Native American, the Sioux, the Catholic, the Muslim, the French, the Greek, the Irish, the rabbi, the priest, the sheik, the gay, the straight, the preacher, the privileged, the homeless, the teacher. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you will come back next week and join us for worship on Sunday in between. Good night.